Hi there, and welcome to part 2 of the Social Inclusion Audit training session. This part will focus specifically on the audit tool. So what we're going to look at here is the framework for the audit, how you score the audit, and some of the questions. So you probably already know that in social inclusion that there are 3 indicators: the indicator of openness, indicator of intentionality, and the indicator of inclusion. And we're going to go through and describe each of these before we get into the audit tool itself. So as you might remember, the social inclusion definition is the participatory, authentic, and accountable manner in which organizations uphold and reinforce the principles of access, equity, and thus social inclusion for all. In particular, social inclusion is the manner in which organizations do the following that you see on the slide. And let me just pop up some of the indicators here for you to see. So in terms of 2 of our 3 indicators, openness and inclusion, we found that a lot of research studies used either one or both of these indicators in their work. But as you can see through this table, there's something missing. And what's missing, we feel, is this level of intentionality that an organization must have to do this work. It's important to be open. It's good to be hopeful that inclusion work will occur, but there's a strong thread of intentionality that is required to enable to remove barriers to inclusion. And we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a separate question, but a whole focus on intentionality itself. And that's why this indicator has this concept of intentionality has its own indicator. So let's get into definitions for all 3 of these indicators. So the indicator of openness, essentially this is how well the organization knows the community. So it's the degree in which the organization is familiar with the community. This can be assessed through needs assessments, demographic profiles, and by the number and the types of relationships with community groups. In terms of the indicator for intentionality, as I mentioned earlier, this is how the organization continues the work of inclusion. So this is quite important. It's the degree in which the organization reinforces the principles of social inclusion. And because this takes a lot of time and some effort, it involves things like the annual completion of the social inclusion audit, the development and implementation of targeted strategies, policies, and procedures. We'll get into this one in a lot more detail later. The 3rd indicator is the indicator of inclusion. And yes, this is called the social inclusion audit, but this really is about demonstrative results. So first, when we talked about the indicator for openness, we talked about how well the organization knows the community. In this indicator, what we're looking at is how well the organization reflects the community. So how well the community is the organization. And this is reflective through all sorts of things like board, staff, and volunteer diversity, and whether the service recipients or the clients of your organization are reflective of your community. So let's take a look now at the brief framework for the social inclusion audit. The social inclusion audit framework focuses on brief, macro, outcome-based statements that are clearly stated and easily assessed. We also wanted to make sure that we created a structure that was flexible enough for organizations that are new to social inclusion to start participating in the process, and also sophisticated enough that organizations who are doing this work and have been doing it for some time can also find some value in this and continue to refine and evaluate their work and mentor others. Also, you'll find that this is flexible enough that you can adapt community group to any group that you're focusing on. The community-based research project that the Canadian Urban Libraries Council focused on was on new immigrant youth in 4 pilot settings across Canada. Perhaps your organization looks at adults with mental health, seniors, youth, women, or other marginalized populations. So you can insert that target group's name within the audit tool. As you can see from this slide, the social inclusion audit tool is quite simple. There are 12 questions, and they are outcome-based statements. The scoring is on a scale from 0 to 4, And we've requested that each question is scored twice. So we're looking for the audit tool to be based on scoring current status in meeting an outcome, as well as the organization's progress in meeting that outcome over time. The status scoring scale per question, as I mentioned before, is on a scale of 0 to 4. As you can see from this slide, a 0 would represent that the organization has not started or does not meet the requirements. A scoring of number 1 would mean that it meets minimal requirements. 2 would mean that it meets partial requirements. 3, substantial requirements, and a 4, of course, meets all or most. So let me explain this a little bit more. Each outcome-based question might have several parts to it. Say, for example, in question 1, there are 4 parts. If an organization hasn't started any of them, they would get a 0. If the organization meets minimal requirements, perhaps they meet 1 of the 4 requirements. Partial would mean that they would represent perhaps 2 or 50% of the requirements. Substantial would be 3, and of course, meeting all would mean that they met all 4 requirements.